The morning sun painted golden stripes across the kitchen floor, where 5-year-old Charlotte sat cross-legged, watching her mother prepare breakfast. Her dark curls bounced as she tilted her head, studying the way soap bubbles danced in the dishwater. Mrs. Henderson had been washing the same plate for what seemed like forever, creating a mountain of rainbow spheres that floated lazily above the sink. "Mama, why do bubbles fly?" Charlotte asked, her green eyes wide with curiosity. "They're lighter than air, sweetheart," her mother replied, blowing gently on a cluster that had formed on her finger. The bubbles separated and drifted toward Charlotte, who scrambled to her feet with excitement. Charlotte reached out with both hands, trying to catch the shimmering orbs, but they popped the moment her fingers touched them. She giggled and clapped, delighted by the magic happening right in her own kitchen. Her mother smiled, remembering her own childhood fascination with such simple wonders. "Can we make more?" Charlotte pleaded, tugging at her mother's apron. Mrs. Henderson looked at the breakfast dishes that still needed attention, then at her daughter's hopeful face. The chores could wait a few minutes. She reached under the sink and pulled out a small bottle of dish soap, then grabbed a plastic cup from the cabinet. "Let's go outside," she suggested, and Charlotte's face lit up like Christmas morning. In the backyard, Mrs. Henderson mixed soap with water while Charlotte waited impatiently, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The grass was still damp with morning dew, and the air was cool and crisp. Perfect bubble weather, as Charlotte's grandmother used to say. When the mixture was ready, Mrs. Henderson dipped a plastic wand into the solution and lifted it to her lips. With a gentle breath, she created a stream of bubbles that caught the sunlight and transformed into floating jewels. Charlotte shrieked with delight and began chasing them across the yard. Her small feet pounded against the soft earth as she pursued each bubble with determination. Some were tiny and quick, darting between the rose bushes like fairy sprites. Others were large and slow, giving her a better chance to catch them before they inevitably burst. But catching them wasn't really the point. The joy was in the chase itself, in a way her heart raced as she ran, in a laughter that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her chest. Charlotte's neighbor, 7-year-old George Martinez, heard the commotion from his bedroom window. He had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and feeling sorry for himself because his best friend Tommy was sick with the flu. George had been looking forward to their planned adventure in the woods behind their houses, but now he faced a long, boring day with nothing to do. The sound of Charlotte's laughter drew him to the window. He pressed his nose against the glass and watched as she danced around her yard, arms outstretched, chasing something he couldn't quite see from his angle. Curiosity got the better of him, and he dressed quickly before heading downstairs. "Mom, can I go outside?" he called toward the kitchen. "Of course, me, Joe," came the reply. "Just stay where I can see you." George stepped onto his family's back porch and immediately saw the bubbles floating over the fence that separated his yard from Charlotte's. They were magnificent, catching the light and reflecting tiny rainbows in their soap film walls. He had never paid much attention to bubbles before, but seeing Charlotte's pure joy as she chased them made him want to understand what was so special about them. "Charlotte," he called over the fence. "What are you doing?" "Catching bubbles," she called back, not stopping her pursuit. "But they keep disappearing." George watched for a few more minutes, mesmerized by the way the bubbles moved. Some rose high into the air, carried by invisible breezes. Others seemed to dance just out of Charlotte's reach, as if they were playing a game with her. A particularly large bubble drifted over the fence into George's yard, and, without thinking, he reached out to touch it. Pop! The bubble vanished, leaving only a tiny drop of soapy water on his fingertip. George stared at his hand in wonder. He had never really thought about bubbles before. They were just something that happened when you took a bath or helped wash dishes. But seeing one up close, watching the way the light played across its surface before it disappeared forever, made him realize there was something almost magical about them. "George," Charlotte called, having noticed him at the fence. "Do you want to chase bubbles with me?" George looked back toward his house, then at Charlotte's hopeful face. He had planned to spend the day feeling sorry for himself, but maybe there was something better to do after all. "I'll be right over," he said, heading for the gate that connected their backyards. Mrs. Henderson smiled as George joined them, handing him a bubble wand of his own. "The more the merrier," she said, refilling the soap solution. George dipped his wand carefully, the way he had seen Charlotte's mother do it. His first attempt created only a few small bubbles, but they were perfect spheres that caught the morning light beautifully. Charlotte clapped and immediately began chasing them, her previous bubbles forgotten in favor of these new ones. "They're so pretty," George said, surprised by his own reaction. "And slippery," Charlotte added, having just missed catching another one. "They don't want to be caught." George made more bubbles, experimenting with different speeds and angles. Some of his breaths were too hard, creating only foam. Others were too gentle, producing bubbles too small to chase. But gradually he found the perfect technique, creating a steady stream of medium-sized bubbles that danced away from his wand like escaped pearls. Charlotte had given up trying to catch the bubbles and instead began following them wherever they went. She discovered that they seemed to have personalities of their own. Some bubbles were adventurous, sailing high over the fence into neighboring yards. Others were shy, hiding among the flower petals or behind tree leaves. A few were show-offs, spinning and twirling in the air as if performing just for her. George found himself drawn into Charlotte's world of bubble personalities. He began naming them as he created them. "This one's Explorer," he announced as a large bubble sailed toward the apple tree. "And this one's Dancer," he added, watching a smaller bubble spin in circles. "That one's Rainbow," Charlotte shouted, pointing at a bubble that had caught the light perfectly, displaying every color imaginable across its surface. For the first time since Tommy had gotten sick, George forgot about feeling lonely. He was completely absorbed in the simple magic of soap bubbles and Charlotte's infectious enthusiasm. Every pop made Charlotte giggle, and every new bubble brought fresh excitement. Mrs. Henderson watched from the patio, enjoying her coffee and her children's laughter. She had worried about Charlotte making friends in their new neighborhood, but George seemed like a kind boy. Different from Charlotte in many ways, more serious and thoughtful, but kind nonetheless. As the morning wore on, George began to understand why Charlotte was so enchanted with bubbles. There was something peaceful about creating them, something hopeful about watching them float away into the big, wide world. Each bubble was unique, living its own brief, beautiful life before disappearing forever. "George," Charlotte said during a brief pause in their bubble making, "do you think bubbles go to bubble heaven when they pop?" George considered this seriously. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe they become invisible and keep floating around us all the time." Charlotte's eyes grew wide. "Like bubble ghosts." "Friendly bubble ghosts," George assured her. "Still playing and dancing, just where we can't see them." This idea delighted Charlotte so much that she began talking to the air around her, welcoming any invisible bubbles that might be listening. George smiled at her imagination, but found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was some truth to the idea of invisible bubbles surrounding them. The morning flew by in a symphony of laughter, gentle breaths, and the soft pop of bursting bubbles. Neither child noticed the time passing, lost as they were in their magical world of soap and sunlight and endless possibility. 3 days later, George woke up with an idea that made him bounce out of bed. He had been thinking about bubbles constantly since that morning with Charlotte, but something had been bothering him. Bubbles were beautiful, but they disappeared so quickly. He wanted something that would last longer, something he could really play with instead of just chasing. He remembered the bag of colorful balloons his aunt had brought him for his birthday last month. They were still tucked away in his closet, forgotten until now. George pulled out the bag and examined the balloons inside. There were red ones, blue ones, yellow ones, green ones, purple ones, and orange ones. Each one was waiting to be filled with air and brought to life. George had blown up balloons before at birthday parties, but he had never really thought about playing with them afterward. Usually they just sat around until they eventually deflated or popped. But now, looking at the colorful rubber in his hands, he imagined all the games he could play. He started with a bright red balloon, stretching it a few times the way his father had taught him. The rubber felt smooth and cool between his fingers. He brought the balloon to his lips and began to blow, watching as it slowly grew from a wrinkled piece of rubber into a perfectly round sphere. The transformation fascinated him. With each breath, the balloon became more alive, more real. When it was fully inflated and tied off, George held it up to the light streaming through his bedroom window. The red was brilliant and cheerful, completely different from the delicate, shimmering transparency of soap bubbles. George bounced the balloon gently on his finger, delighted by how responsive it was. Unlike bubbles, which had minds of their own, balloons seemed eager to play. When he tapped it, it bounced back. When he threw it gently across the room, it floated slowly through the air, giving him time to catch it. Excited by this discovery, George inflated a blue balloon, then a yellow one. Soon his bedroom was filled with colorful spheres bobbing gently in the air currents. Each balloon moved differently. The red one seemed energetic, bouncing higher than the others. The blue one was calm and steady, floating in smooth arcs. The yellow one was playful, spinning as it moved. George began to experiment with different games. He could keep one balloon in the air by tapping it repeatedly, never letting it touch the floor. This was harder than it looked and required quick reflexes and careful positioning. He could throw a balloon high and try to catch it in different ways, behind his back or with his eyes closed. The most fun, though, was letting multiple balloons loose in his room and trying to keep them all airborne at once. This created a wonderful chaos of color and movement that made George laugh out loud. Every time he focused on one balloon, another would start to drift toward the floor, demanding his attention. His laughter carried through the house, and soon his mother appeared in the doorway to investigate. "What's all this?" she asked, smiling at the rainbow of balloons floating around her son. "I'm playing balloon games," George explained, catching a green balloon just before it hit his desk. "They're like bubbles, but better because they don't pop when you touch them." Mrs. Martinez watched her son play for a few minutes, remembering her own childhood balloon games. "You know," she said, "when I was little, my brothers and I used to play balloon volleyball in the living room." George's eyes lit up with interest. "How do you play that?" "Well, you need at least two people," his mother explained. "You try to keep the balloon from touching the ground on your side, and you can only hit it 3 times before you have to send it to the other person." This sounded amazing to George, but he only had himself to play with. Then, he remembered Charlotte next door. She had been so enthusiastic about bubbles. Maybe she would enjoy balloon games too. George gathered up his balloons and headed outside, where he found Charlotte sitting on her back steps, looking somewhat bored. She brightened immediately when she saw him approaching with an armload of colorful balloons. "George," she called, jumping up. "What are those?" "Balloons," George replied, as if this should be obvious. "Want to play with them?" Charlotte had seen balloons before, of course, but had never really played with them. At birthday parties, adults usually inflated them and tied them to chairs or gave them to children to hold. She had never considered that balloons could be toys in themselves. George demonstrated by tossing a red balloon into the air and catching it. "They're like bubbles that don't pop," he explained, "and you can actually play games with them." Intrigued, Charlotte reached for a blue balloon. George showed her how to tap it gently to keep it bouncing, and soon she was giggling as the balloon bobbed unpredictably around her. "It's like the balloon is alive," she said, chasing the blue sphere as it drifted toward the fence. "That's what I thought too," George agreed. "Each one has its own personality, just like your bubbles did." They spent the next hour exploring all the different ways they could play with balloons. Charlotte discovered that balloons were excellent for games of catch, much easier than a ball because they moved slowly and gently. George taught her the art of keeping a balloon in the air using only her feet, which proved challenging but hilarious. The yellow balloon became Charlotte's favorite because it seemed to dance when she batted it around. The purple balloon became George's preferred partner for juggling practice. The orange balloon, they discovered, was perfect for gentle games of keep away because it was just the right size and weight. Charlotte's mother watched from the kitchen window, pleased to see her daughter making friends and playing actively. The children's laughter filled the backyard, punctuated by the gentle squeaking sounds balloons make when they rub together. As they played, Charlotte and George began to invent elaborate games. They created obstacle courses where balloons had to be guided around garden furniture without touching the ground. They invented balloon tag, where being touched by a balloon meant you had to freeze until someone else freed you with a different color balloon. The most exciting game they created was balloon rescue. In this game, they would throw all the balloons high into the air at once, then work together to catch them all before any could touch the ground. This required teamwork, quick thinking, and lots of running around, which suited both children perfectly. "This is even more fun than chasing bubbles," Charlotte declared during a brief rest period, clutching 3 balloons to her chest. George nodded, though privately he thought both activities were wonderful in different ways. Bubbles were magical and mysterious, here one moment and gone the next. Balloons were reliable friends, always ready to play, and impossible to lose track of. As the afternoon wore on, they discovered that balloons had one advantage over almost any other toy. They were virtually indestructible during normal play. Unlike soap bubbles, they didn't disappear at the slightest touch. Unlike balls, they didn't roll away or require hard throws that might break something. Unlike many toys, they didn't have small parts that could get lost or complicated rules that had to be remembered. The simplicity of balloon play appealed to both children, though for different reasons. Charlotte loved how balloons responded to her energy, bouncing higher when she was excited, floating gently when she was calm. George enjoyed the problem-solving aspect, figuring out how to predict where a balloon would go and how to position himself to keep games going. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that matched their balloons, Charlotte and George reluctantly began to gather up their toys. The balloons had provided hours of entertainment, and both children were tired but happy. "Can we play with balloons again tomorrow?" Charlotte asked as George prepared to take his balloons home. "Absolutely," George replied, "and maybe I can bring some different shaped ones. Maya gave me some long, skinny ones, too." Charlotte's eyes widened with excitement. "Long, skinny ones? What can you do with those?" "I don't know yet," George admitted, "but I bet we can figure it out." As they said their goodbyes, both children were already planning the next day's balloon adventures. George had found something even better than bubbles for indoor play, while Charlotte had discovered a new type of magic that lasted longer than soap and air. Neither child slept well that night, their dreams filled with dancing balloons in every color imaginable, floating through worlds where gravity was just a suggestion and fun never had to end. The next morning brought unexpected rain, turning the children's outdoor playground into a muddy mess. Charlotte pressed her face against her bedroom window, watching droplets race down the glass while thunder rumbled in the distance. She had been dreaming about balloon games all night and was disappointed to see their plans washing away with the storm. George stood at his own window, holding the bag of long, skinny balloons he had promised to bring. The modeling balloons, his aunt had called them, though George had no idea what that meant. He had been excited to show Charlotte these strange new toys, but the weather seemed determined to keep them apart. Then, George had an idea. His family's garage was large and mostly empty since his father had cleaned it out last month. The concrete floor was smooth and perfect for balloon games, and there was plenty of room to run around. Best of all, it was completely dry. George ran downstairs to find his mother reading in the living room. "Mom, can Charlotte and I play in the garage today? It's too wet outside." Mrs. Martinez looked up from her book and glanced toward the window, where rain was pelting the glass. "I suppose so," she said. "Just be careful not to knock anything over, and keep the door open so I can hear you." George's face lit up. He grabbed his raincoat and splashed across both yards to Charlotte's back door, the bag of balloons tucked safely under his jacket. Charlotte's mother answered his knock with a surprised smile. "George, what are you doing out in this weather?" "Can Charlotte come play in my garage?" George asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. "I have special balloons to show her, and we can stay dry in there." Mrs. Henderson called Charlotte, who appeared at the door still in her pajamas, but wide awake with curiosity. When she saw George holding a mysterious bag, her disappointment about the rain vanished completely. 10 minutes later, both children stood in George's garage, staring at the long, narrow balloons George had dumped onto an old blanket. These weren't like the round balloons they had played with yesterday. These were thin and looked impossibly long when deflated, like colorful rubber snakes. "What do you do with them?" Charlotte asked, picking up a red one and stretching it experimentally. "I think you blow them up like regular balloons," George said, though he wasn't entirely sure. "But my aunt said something about making shapes with them." George selected a blue balloon and began to inflate it. These balloons were much harder to blow up than regular ones, and it took several attempts before he managed to create a long, sausage-like shape. The inflated balloon was about 3 feet long and surprisingly flexible. Charlotte watched in fascination as George experimented with bending the balloon. To their amazement, it held whatever shape he twisted it into. When he made a curve, it stayed curved. When he bent it into a U shape, it remained that way. "It's like a rubber rope," Charlotte exclaimed, grabbing her own balloon to inflate. Her first attempts were unsuccessful. The long balloons required more lung power and technique than she was used to. George helped her, and together they managed to create a bright red balloon that matched his blue one. Now they had 2 long, flexible balloons to experiment with. Charlotte immediately began bending hers into different shapes, delighted by how it responded to her touch. She made waves, spirals, and zigzags, each more elaborate than the last. George took a more systematic approach, trying to figure out exactly how the balloons worked. He discovered that if he twisted the balloon at certain points, he could create separate sections that wouldn't unwind. This opened up entirely new possibilities. "Look," George said excitedly, twisting his balloon into 3 separate sections. "I made a train." Charlotte studied his creation. It did look like a simple train, with the middle section as the main car, and the 2 end sections as the engine and caboose. Inspired by George's success, she began experimenting with twisting techniques. Her first attempts resulted in balloons that immediately untwisted themselves, but George showed her the secret. You had to hold each twist while making the next one, then twist them together to lock them in place. It was like learning a new language, one spoken with fingers instead of words. Soon both children were creating increasingly complex shapes. Charlotte made what she declared to be a balloon flower, with twisted petals and a long stem. George crafted something that resembled a dog, complete with a head, body, and 4 legs. The garage filled with their excited chatter as they discovered new techniques. They learned that some twists worked better than others, that balloons could be connected together to make larger creations, and that patience was essential because rushing led to deflated disasters. Charlotte's natural artistic instincts serve her well with the modeling balloons. She had an intuitive sense for proportion and color that helped her create pleasing shapes. George's logical mind helped him understand the mechanics of twisting, and he quickly became skilled at creating recognizable objects. As the morning progressed, they developed a routine. George would inflate the balloons, since he had mastered that challenging skill first. Charlotte would choose the colors and help plan what they wanted to create. Then they would work together, with George handling the technical twisting while Charlotte provided creative input and encouragement. Their first major collaboration was a balloon garden. They used green balloons for stems and leaves, then added flowers in every color they had. The finished creation covered most of the garage floor and looked genuinely impressive, even if some of the flowers were more abstract than realistic. Charlotte was particularly proud of a purple balloon she had shaped into what she claimed was a butterfly. George couldn't quite see the resemblance, but he admired the creativity and the way she had managed to create symmetrical wings through careful twisting. George's masterpiece was a balloon sword, complete with a detailed handle and a long, straight blade. As they worked, they began to understand why these were called modeling balloons. Unlike regular balloons, which were meant to float and bounce, these were designed to be shaped and sculpted. They were tools for creation rather than just toys for play. The rain continued to drum on the garage roof, creating a cozy atmosphere that made their indoor adventure feel special. Charlotte found the sound soothing, almost like music to accompany their artistic endeavors. George enjoyed the feeling of being in their own private world, safe and dry while the storm raged outside. Their balloon creations became increasingly ambitious as their confidence grew. They attempted a balloon castle, using multiple balloons twisted together to form towers and walls. The structure was wobbly and abstract, but it stayed together and sparked their imaginations about balloon architecture. Charlotte suggested they make balloon people to live in their castle. This proved to be their biggest challenge yet, requiring multiple balloons per figure and careful planning to create recognizable human shapes. Their first balloon person looked more like a stick figure than a human, but they were both pleased with their progress. George was fascinated by the problem-solving aspect of balloon modeling. Each creation required him to think three-dimensionally, planning how to achieve certain shapes and figuring out the sequence of twists needed. It was like puzzle solving, but with colorful, flexible pieces that responded to his touch. As lunchtime approached, the garage looked like a balloon wonderland. Their creations covered every surface, a testament to hours of creative collaboration. Some were recognizable objects, others were pure abstract art, but all were products of their shared imagination and growing skill. Charlotte stood among their balloon forest, feeling a deep satisfaction that was different from the joy she felt chasing soap bubbles. This was the satisfaction of creation, of making something that hadn't existed before. Each balloon shape told a story, and together they had built an entire world. George felt proud of their technical achievements, but more importantly, he felt the warm glow of shared accomplishment. Working together had made everything more fun, and seeing Charlotte's excitement when a difficult twist finally worked correctly was almost as satisfying as his own successes. Neither child wanted to leave their balloon wonderland when their mothers called for lunch. They had discovered something magical about working together, about combining their different strengths to create something neither could have achieved alone. The rainy day that had started as a disappointment had become one of their best adventures yet. By the following week, word had spread through the neighborhood about Charlotte and George's amazing balloon creations. Tommy, George's best friend who had recovered from his flu, was the first to visit their garage workshop. His eyes widened when he saw the balloon garden still displayed on one wall, and the collection of balloon animals arranged on a makeshift shelf. "You guys made all this?" Tommy asked, picking up the balloon sword George had crafted days earlier. "George does the twisting, and I pick the colors and help with ideas," Charlotte explained proudly. "Want to learn how?" Soon Tommy was attempting his first balloon twist under George's patient instruction. It was harder than it looked, and Tommy's first balloon deflated with a loud pop that made all three children jump. But George simply handed him another balloon, and Charlotte offered encouraging words. "My first 10 balloons popped," Charlotte confided to Tommy. "But then George taught me the secret about not gripping too tight." Word of their balloon workshop reached other children in the neighborhood. Sarah from 2 houses down came to investigate, followed by the twins Marcus and Michael from across the street. Before long, George's garage had become the unofficial neighborhood activity center. Charlotte thrived in her role as color coordinator and creative director. She had an eye for which colors worked well together and could envision finished projects that others couldn't imagine from a pile of uninflated balloons. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and she encouraged even the most frustrated beginners to keep trying. George discovered he had a natural teaching ability. He could break down complex, twisting sequences into simple steps that other children could follow. He was patient with mistakes and generous with praise, qualities that made him an excellent instructor. The children's balloon skills improved rapidly with practice and peer encouragement. They learned to make increasingly sophisticated creations: balloon hats, balloon jewelry, balloon vehicles, and balloon creatures, both real and imaginary. Each success built their confidence and inspired them to attempt even more challenging projects. Mrs. Martinez found herself providing snacks and drinks for what had become a daily gathering of 6 or 7 children. She was amazed by how well they all worked together, with Charlotte and George naturally taking leadership roles while still including everyone in the creative process. One afternoon, Sarah suggested they organize a balloon art show for their parents. "We can make our best stuff and then display it," she said excitedly, "like a real art gallery." Charlotte's eyes lit up at this idea. "We could have different sections: animals in one area, flowers in another, and maybe weird abstract stuff too." George was immediately drawn to the organizational challenge. "We need to plan it out," he said thoughtfully. "Decide who makes what, and figure out how to display everything so it looks good." The project consumed the children's attention for the next 3 days. They held planning meetings where they assigned different children to different categories. Tommy volunteered to focus on balloon vehicles. Sarah chose to specialize in balloon jewelry. The twins decided to work together on large, complex sculptures. Charlotte appointed herself as the overall artistic director, responsible for the color scheme and the arrangement of displays. George became the technical supervisor, helping solve difficult twisting problems and ensuring that all creations met their quality standards. The garage was transformed into a genuine workshop. Mrs. Martinez donated a large piece of cardboard that the children painted white to serve as a backdrop for their display. George's father contributed some wooden boards and sawhorses to create display tables. Charlotte's mother provided colored fabric to drape over the tables. As the art show date approached, the children worked with increasing focus and dedication. They developed an efficient production system where George would inflate balloons in batches, Charlotte would sort them by color and distribute them according to each person's project needs, and everyone would work on their assigned creations. The quality of their work improved dramatically under the pressure of creating something worthy of an art show. Charlotte's balloon flowers became more detailed and realistic. George's balloon animals developed distinct personalities and more accurate proportions. The other children rose to meet the higher standards, producing work that surprised even themselves. On the morning of their art show, the garage was buzzing with activity. The children arranged and rearranged their displays, debating the best placement for each piece. Charlotte insisted that colors should flow harmoniously from one section to the next. George focused on ensuring that each creation was securely positioned and properly lit. When the parents arrived that evening, they were genuinely amazed by what they saw. The garage had been transformed into a professional-looking gallery space, complete with handwritten labels for each section and carefully arranged lighting that showed off the balloon creations to best advantage. Charlotte's balloon garden had evolved into a full landscape, complete with trees, flowers, and even a balloon rainbow arcing across one corner. George's balloon zoo featured a dozen different animals, each with unique characteristics and expressive poses. Tommy's vehicle collection included cars, trucks, airplanes, and something he called a rocket submarine. The twins' collaboration had produced a massive balloon castle that filled one entire corner of the garage. Sarah's jewelry collection was displayed on a fabric-covered mannequin head, featuring balloon tiaras, necklaces, and bracelets that actually looked wearable. But the centerpiece of the show was a collaborative creation that all the children had worked on together, a balloon sculpture they called Friendship Tree. Each child had contributed branches in their favorite colors, and Charlotte had woven them together into a tree shape, with George providing the technical expertise to make all the connections secure. The parents were impressed not just by the artistic quality of the work, but by the evidence of cooperation and shared creativity. They could see that this had been more than just play. It had been a genuine learning experience in teamwork, problem-solving, and artistic expression. Mrs. Henderson was particularly moved by Charlotte's transformation over the past few weeks. Her daughter had always been creative, but working with George and The other children had given her confidence and leadership skills that were new and wonderful to see. Mr. Martinez was proud of George's teaching abilities and his technical innovations. His son had always been good with his hands, but seeing him patiently help younger children and solve complex engineering problems with rubber and air was remarkable. The art show was such a success that the children immediately began planning their next project. Sarah suggested they learn to make balloon costumes for Halloween. Tommy wanted to attempt balloon furniture. The twins proposed a balloon amusement park with working rides. Charlotte and George exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. They had started something much bigger than either of them had imagined. What began as a simple experiment with soap bubbles and colorful balloons had grown into a neighborhood community of young artists and engineers. As the evening wound down and parents collected their children, Charlotte and George stood in their garage workshop, surrounded by the remnants of their successful art show. The space looked different now, not just like a garage where they played, but like a real studio where important creative work happened. "Tomorrow," Charlotte said, carefully packing away her favorite balloon flower, "we should start working on those Halloween costumes." "Definitely," George agreed, already mentally planning the technical challenges involved in wearable balloon art. "But first, I want to figure out how to make balloons that light up." Charlotte's eyes sparkled with excitement. Glowing balloon costumes for Halloween. That would be amazing. As they turned off the garage lights and headed home, both children were already lost in dreams of their next creative adventure, their minds filled with visions of illuminated balloon art dancing through the October darkness. 3 months later, on a crisp October morning, Charlotte and George stood before a display case in the front window of Miller's toy store downtown. Inside the case, illuminated by warm spotlights, sat 3 of their balloon creations: Charlotte's rainbow flower bouquet, George's mechanical-looking balloon robot, and their collaborative dragon sculpture that had taken 2 weeks to perfect. "I still can't believe Mrs. Miller wanted to buy them," Charlotte whispered, pressing her nose against the cool glass. George nodded, equally amazed. "And she wants us to teach classes here on Saturday mornings." The path to this moment had been unexpected and wonderful. After their successful neighborhood art show, word had spread beyond their circle of friends. Parents had shared photos of the balloon creations on social media, where they caught the attention of local community groups. Someone had forwarded the pictures to Mrs. Miller, who owned the toy store and was always looking for creative activities for children. Mrs. Miller had visited their garage workshop 2 weeks ago, arriving with her grandchildren and a business proposition that left both children speechless. She wanted to feature their balloon art in her store window and hire them to teach balloon sculpting classes for other children. "But we're just kids," George had protested when Mrs. Miller first explained her idea. "The best teachers for children are often other children," Mrs. Miller had replied with a knowing smile. "You two have something special. You've created not just art, but a whole community of young artists." Charlotte had been immediately excited by the prospect of sharing their techniques with even more children. George had been more cautious, worried about the responsibility of teaching strangers, but Charlotte's enthusiasm was contagious. Their first official class was scheduled for that Saturday morning, and 6 children had already signed up. Charlotte had spent the previous evening organizing their supplies and planning which projects would be best for beginners. George had practiced his teaching explanations in front of his bedroom mirror, wanting to make sure he could break down complex techniques into simple steps. The preparation had been a learning experience in itself. They had to think more carefully about their methods, organizing them into lessons that could be taught to others. This process had actually improved their own skills, as explaining techniques to others forced them to understand exactly why certain approaches worked better than others. Mrs. Miller had provided them with a dedicated workspace in the back room of her toy store, complete with proper tables, good lighting, and storage for their growing collection of balloons and tools. Charlotte had decorated the space with some of their favorite creations, while George had organized the supplies in a system that made everything easy to find. "Are you nervous about today?" Charlotte asked as they walked toward the toy store for their first official class. "A little," George admitted. What if the kids don't like it as much as we do? What if I can't explain things clearly enough? You'll be great, Charlotte assured him. Remember how patient you were with Tommy when he kept popping balloons? And how you helped Sarah figure out that tricky elephant trunk twist? George smiled, remembering those early teaching moments in their garage. Charlotte was right. He had developed good instincts for helping other children learn. And Charlotte's gift for encouragement and creative inspiration would make any class better. When they arrived at the toy store, they found 6 eager children waiting with their parents. The ages ranged from 5 to 10, and Charlotte was delighted to see both boys and girls in the group. George noticed that some of the children looked confident and excited, while others seemed shy or uncertain. "Welcome to our first official balloon sculpting class," Charlotte announced, her natural stage presence shining through. "I'm Charlotte, and this is George. We've been learning balloon art for 3 months, and now we want to teach you everything we know." George took over the introduction of basic safety rules and techniques. The most important thing to remember is that balloons will pop sometimes, and that's totally normal. When it happens, we just get a new balloon and try again. They started with simple projects, just as they had in their own learning journey. George demonstrated the basic twist, while Charlotte provided encouragement and troubleshooting for children who were struggling. Their natural partnership, developed over months of working together, made them an effective teaching team. Charlotte's talent for seeing the artistic potential in imperfect attempts was particularly valuable. When 7-year-old Emma's balloon dog turned out lopsided and abstract, Charlotte praised it as creative and unique, then helped Emma understand which twists could be adjusted to achieve different effects. George's systematic approach helped the children understand not just how to make specific shapes, but why certain techniques worked. When 9-year-old Marcus wanted to make his balloon sword longer, George explained the physics of balloon tension and showed him how to plan the proportions before starting to twist. The first class flew by in a whirlwind of colorful rubber, excited chatter, and proud displays of finished creations. Every child left with at least one completed balloon sculpture and the confidence to attempt more complex projects at home. "That was amazing," Mrs. Miller told Charlotte and George as they cleaned up after the class. "I've never seen children so engaged and supportive of each other. You two have a real gift for teaching." Charlotte beamed at the compliment, but George looked thoughtful. "I think it's because we remember what it was like to be beginners," he said. "We know how frustrating it can be when balloons keep popping, and we know how good it feels when you finally get a twist to work right." Over the following weeks, their Saturday classes grew in popularity. Word spread through the community about the 2 young balloon artists who could teach other children to create amazing sculptures. Some children came for just one class, while others returned week after week, developing real skill and joining what was becoming a small community of young balloon artists. Charlotte and George found that teaching others improved their own abilities as well. Explaining techniques forced them to analyze their methods more carefully, leading to insights that made them better artists. Watching other children's creative approaches inspired new ideas and techniques they hadn't considered. The collaboration that had begun with chasing soap bubbles and bouncing regular balloons had evolved into something neither child could have imagined. They were running a small business, teaching other children, creating art that was displayed in a real store, and building a community of young artists throughout their town. But perhaps most importantly, they had learned that sharing knowledge and skills with others multiplied the joy rather than diminishing it. Every child who learned to twist their first balloon animal, every parent who smiled with pride at their child's creation, every successful class that ended with laughter and accomplishment added to Charlotte and George's own satisfaction and sense of purpose. On a quiet Sunday evening in late October, Charlotte and George sat in their original workshop in George's garage, working on a new creation together. The space was different now, more organized and efficient, but still filled with the warmth and creativity that had made it special from the beginning. "Do you ever miss when it was just the 2 of us figuring things out?" Charlotte asked, carefully adjusting a twist in the balloon flower she was making. George considered the question while working on the intricate dragon head he was sculpting. Sometimes, he said honestly, but I like seeing other kids get as excited about this as we do. And I like that we're good at teaching them. Charlotte nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Plus, Tommy came up with that technique for making balloon bridges that I never would have thought of. And Sarah's color combinations are sometimes better than mine. The twins' engineering ideas are pretty cool too, George added. I learned a lot from watching them figure out how to make that balloon crane actually work. As they worked in comfortable silence, both children felt the satisfaction of a journey that had led them far beyond anything they had originally imagined. What started as simple play had become a passion, a skill, a business, and a way of connecting with their community. Charlotte finished her flower and held it up to admire the delicate petals she had created through patient twisting and careful color selection. George completed his dragon head and attached it to the body he had been working on for 3 days, creating a sculpture that rivaled anything they had seen in books about professional balloon artists. What should we try to learn next? Charlotte asked, always eager for the next creative challenge. George smiled, his mind already racing with possibilities. I read about something called balloon weaving, and there's this thing called balloon printing where you can actually paint on balloons. Oh, and Mrs. Miller mentioned that some balloon artists make entire costumes that people can wear. Charlotte's eyes sparkled with excitement as she imagined all the new techniques they could master and teach to others. The future stretched out before them, filled with colorful possibilities and the promise of sharing their joy in creation with anyone willing to learn. Outside, the autumn wind carried the last fallen leaves past the garage window, but inside their workshop, Charlotte and George continued creating, learning, and dreaming of all the balloon adventures yet to come.